Hi, it's Mr. Ramage, and this video lesson is going to cover what's happening on the home front in the United States during World War II. So let's take a look at the standard that we're going to be working on and the content that's going to come from it. The standard is the United States policy and mobilization of its economic and military resources during World War II affected American society. Despite mistreatment, marginalized groups played important roles in the war effort while continuing to protest unfair treatment. So let's jump into it. In our previous lesson, we looked at the events that led America to declare war on Japan in 1941, and a few days later, Germany and Italy declared war on the United States. Well, the United States is going to need a draft, and actually the draft began before the United States joined the war. As the war in Europe began, and things started to look pretty bad as France surrendered and Nazi Germany gained control of most of Western Europe, in September of 1940, the United States government instituted the Selective Service Act, which was passed during World War I, instituting for the first time in the country's history a peacetime draft. Now, this wasn't exactly popular, but it seemed necessary as the United States was moving towards being brought into this conflict. Following the attack on Pearl Harbor in December of 1941, within the next month, 60,000 men volunteered for the military after Pearl Harbor was bombed. All told, by the time the war is over, more than 16 million American men and women are going to serve in the United States Armed Forces during the war, with another 3.5 million working as federal civilian employees. Now, unfortunately, the United States military was a segregated military at the time. Going back to World War I, African American soldiers served in segregated units, and that tradition, unfortunately, will continue in World War II, with African American soldiers serving underneath the command of white officers. Now, during the war, they are going to see more combat opportunities and will be engaged in more fighting with the enemy, but will still primarily serve in support roles in the U.S. military. During the war, African Americans supported what was known as the WWII campaign. This was put forth by the Pittsburgh Courier, which was the largest African American newspaper in the country at the time. And WWII stood for Victory Abroad, meaning victory against Hitler and his racism that he was employing in Nazi Germany and now throughout most of Europe, especially with his attacks on Jewish people. And then victory at home against racism and segregation. African American soldiers were fighting for democracy for others, but were not guaranteed democracy at home for themselves. This WWII campaign will encourage African Americans to support the war as a means of winning more democracy at home after the war is over. That's something that's going to spark, again, another movement towards African American civil rights in the United States, especially in a post-World War II era. Other groups in the United States are also going to fight and represent not only themselves, but their country in the war. Groups at home that suffered overwhelming racism and prejudice and mistreatment, these marginalized groups are going to volunteer as well as be drafted and serve in the military with honors and distinction. 33,000 Japanese Americans are going to serve in the United States Army, many of them coming from the internment camps, which we're going to cover a little bit later in this video. Over 500,000 Hispanic Americans are also going to serve in World War II. 25,000 Native Americans serving in the United States Armed Forces as well, including the very famous Navajo code talkers, whose use of the Navajo language in terms of communicating code in the Pacific was instrumental in the United States gaining the advantage over the Japanese. And 550,000 Jewish Americans also served, and you can try to understand their motivation for joining the war effort to defeat Nazi Germany and to try to protect Jewish family members and fellow Jews in Europe. Well, during the war, the United States has to bring its economy back from the Great Depression now to a wartime economy. And the war truly is the event that ends the Great Depression. So from 1929 all the way up to 1941, America could not quite get out of the Great Depression despite all of the different programs and actions that were taken as part of Roosevelt's first and second New Deal. But it's the war that really rejuvenates the American economy. So as a wartime economy, 200,000 businesses are going to shift from producing regular materials now to war materials. And the war is going to bring jobs to the American people. 19 million jobs were created during the war, with the average family wages doubling during this time period. Women are also going to enter the workforce just like they did in World War I. 4 million women are going to go to work for the government, mostly in clerical positions, but about 2.5 million women will also join the workforce in war-related industries, building planes, tanks, jeeps, producing munitions. So the war does increase the number of women in the workforce, and of course, Rosie the Riveter becomes the iconic symbol of the American working woman who rolls up her sleeves and gets to work to help win the war. So all told, from the start of the war, we have about 12.9 million women in the workforce. By the time the war is over, about 18.8 million women will be employed in American manufacturing positions. Many of these women, though, will leave the workforce after the war is over, but definitely changes the role of women and the expectation of what they're capable of doing in a quote-unquote man's position. Now, racism, of course, becomes a part of almost everything that we talk about in American history, and many industries and businesses resisted hiring African American men and women during the war. This leads President Roosevelt to sign Executive Order 8802, one of a few executive orders that we're going to discuss in this video lesson. Executive Order 8802 stated that, quote, "There shall be no discrimination in the employment of workers in defense industries or government because of race, creed, color, or national origin." So thanks to Executive Order 8802, 1 million African Americans are going to enter wartime factories and businesses, over half of them actually being women. So there's now more opportunities for African American workers to work in industries that are producing goods for the war effort. Now, wages weren't always exactly fair. That's one of the things that unfortunately wasn't exactly equal underneath Executive Order 8802, as many businesses still chose to pay minority workers less than white workers. Now, Mexicans were also a very important part of the workforce in the United States. The Bracero Program, which was instituted by President Roosevelt, Mexican Farm Labor Program, brought Mexican workers into the United States to take jobs in American farming and agriculture, as well as support and work on roads and railroads. Due to the number of men leaving for the military, there was definitely a labor shortage in these industries, and about 200,000 Mexicans are going to work in the United States on farms and railroads in the Southwest. This program will actually continue on until the 1960s. During the war, many wartime industries and factories were located in different parts of the country. So as people sought work and jobs, there's actually going to be a lot of movement and migration for people throughout the United States looking for work in war industries. A lot of people are going to actually move back to the South in an area known as the Sun Belt, as the southern part of California, specifically San Diego, down into Arizona, New Mexico, Florida, and into the other deep parts of the South, known as the Sun Belt, will have many, many large industries for the war effort. So during the war, there's a lot of movement of Americans to different parts of the countries for work in wartime industries. Now, one of the darker parts of America's history in terms of World War II was the internment of Japanese Americans. Following the bombing of Pearl Harbor, there was a lot of very negative reaction towards people in the United States who were either Japanese immigrants or the descendants of Japanese immigrants, second and third generation American citizens who happened to be of Japanese ancestry. The fear was that now we are at war with Japan, that these people were not to be trusted, that they were traitors and they were spies, they were saboteurs, that they were going to be loyal to Japan and not loyal to the United States. So in February of 1942, just 2 months after the bombing of Pearl Harbor, President Roosevelt signs Executive Order 9066. This executive order allows for the removal and detainment of over 120,000 people of Japanese descent to military internment camps where they will be held for the duration of the war. Now, most of the people who are going to be removed from their homes and placed into these camps were American citizens, and is a clear violation of their civil rights protected by the Constitution. But fear, prejudice, and paranoia were more important than those things, as Americans saw these Japanese people as a threat. Executive Order 9066 also allowed for the internment of Italian and German immigrants, as well as Italian and American and German American citizens. This is something that's not as well known as the Japanese internment. About 11,500 people of German ancestry and about 3,000 people of Italian ancestry were placed in Department of Justice camps in different parts of the country. Also, German and Italian families who were not placed in the camps were forced to move away from the coast. So if you lived near the Atlantic or Pacific or Gulf Coast in the United States, you were actually told that you had to move 150 miles inland. Again, fear and prejudice of the people that we're at war with is sort of taking precedence over people's rights. Now, fighting the war is going to require the work and sacrifice of all Americans, and one thing that the government's going to do, very much like it did in World War I, was to take aggressive control of American business and manufacturing and sort of institute price controls, wage controls, and sort of direct the American industry on what to produce for the war effort. President Roosevelt created the Office of Price Administration and Civilian Supply, or OPACS, as well as the Office of Economic Stabilization, OES. And the jobs of these two government agencies was to make sure that prices were regulated, as well as wages, making sure that there wasn't severe inflation like America experienced during World War I, where prices rose significantly due to an increase of demand. Also, the War Labor Board is going to work with labor unions to make sure that union workers don't go on strike during the war, just like they did in World War I. Overall, there is going to be some inflation, but not nearly as much as there was in World War I. Also, OPACS and OES instituted rationing for certain products that were necessary during the war. Rationing means that American citizens at home are not going to be able to purchase as much of certain products as they would like to, and those products were going to be rationed by the government. American citizens would receive a ration book full of coupons, and you had to use those coupons to purchase certain goods. Without coupons, you could not purchase any, and if you went over your allotted coupons, you would have to wait till you received another ration book from the government. The idea behind the rationing meant that there was always going to be enough materials for the war effort, and that Americans at home would not be in competition with each other for those products, and would help to keep prices stable. There's some propaganda and materials here on the screen that kind of show you. In the poster on the right, it says rationing means a fair share for all of us, and we can see what happens without rationing at the top as the woman walks away with all of her meat products, while the other woman is left with a very simple looking little lamb chop. And at the bottom with rationing, both of them have their ration book, they're smiling, and the butcher is smiling, holding onto their coupons. In the center it says rationing safeguards your share, again making sure that everybody understands that nobody is getting more than anyone else. This is going to help people to support this program because they understand that things are going to be as fair as possible. During the war with rationing, a lot of people had to do without certain foods that they were used to. One of those things happens to be butter. So magazines and newspapers, as well as the government, put out lots of information, especially to women who are typically doing the cooking in the 1940s, for how to cook foods that they don't necessarily always cook with. There were wartime cookbooks, which allowed you to gain access to recipes for certain cuts of meat that you may not normally have, or how to cook food that you maybe aren't necessarily always used to. Also, propaganda posters pushed rationing and reinforced the idea that, we need to go without so that the soldiers will have enough. So you see lots of images of American soldiers used in materials to support the rationing. Also, saving materials is important in terms of fats that you're using at home. So this piece of advertisement tells you the importance of saving your fats because those could be used to make explosives and what to do with them, like bacon fat and other cooking grease, and how you can turn them in to help support the war effort. And then probably my most famous piece of propaganda is rationing of gasoline. Americans were encouraged to do car sharing and to cut down on travel when necessary, not to go on long trips, to conserve gasoline, because when you ride alone, you ride with Hitler. One of my favorites. Americans were also encouraged to grow victory gardens. Hey, it's even going to be promoted in comic books for kids, as we can see Superman, Batman, and Robin planting their own victory garden. So with rationing going on, one way that you can get the food that you want was to actually grow your own. So victory gardens were encouraged in the United States. Canning vegetables and fruits was also something else that people were encouraged to do, again, to save on food, cut down on waste, and make sure there was enough food for the war effort. Scrap metal drives were something else that were common, as Americans were encouraged to round up, turn in any scrap metal that they had so that it could be used for the war efforts. This image here in the bottom right, scrap will do it, help hang Hitler, and they actually have a little mannequin of Hitler there that they look like they're going to string up with a rope. Pretty interesting. And again, other pieces of propaganda show that if you turn in your scrap, you're helping to win the war effort. Give me a lift for the big scrap. If your scrap pile could talk, it would ask for a ride to town so it could help win the war. So again, Americans were encouraged to go without, but also to salvage scrap metals and paper and rubber and other materials for the war effort. But probably one of the biggest contributions American made to the war effort was actually paying for the war. The war is going to be ridiculously expensive, about $300 billion. So to fund the war effort beyond raising taxes, which the government does do during the war, the government, like in World War I, is going to institute war bonds. So war bonds were purchased by the public. You would purchase a bond from the government. The government would take your money. You would get a certificate, and then you would be able to cash that back in about 10 or 20 years, and you would get your money back plus some interest. It's essentially creating a loan between you and the government. So we see some propaganda posters here encouraging Americans to purchase those war bonds, again, using fear with the shadow of the swastika around the children. Don't let that shadow touch them. Buy war bonds. If you buy the bonds, you're actually helping to win the war, which you were. More fear and stereotypes and prejudice used in this one, as we see a overly stereotypical Japanese soldier choking a woman. It says, "Keep this horror from your home. Invest 10% in war bonds." So the idea would be to take 10% of your paycheck every 2 weeks or week, and then purchase war bonds with those. And then also Keep Us Flying. This uses a famous Tuskegee Airmen from the United States Air Force, the African-American pilots who were flying over in Europe, again, encouraging Americans to buy war bonds. And the American public is going to react to this and purchase about $50 billion worth of war bonds to help support the war effort. So that's a quick look at the content from World War II that fits into the standard. So the United States policy and mobilization of its economic and military resources during World War II affected American society. So we've got the rationing of materials during the war, the push for Americans to purchase war bonds. We've got the draft that's going to be drafting men into the war, as well as those that volunteer. We are going to see wartime industries grow throughout the country, which results in the movement of people to different parts of America. We also see, despite mistreatment, marginalized groups played important roles in the war effort while continuing to protest unfair treatment at home, right? So African American soldiers are fighting in segregated units, but are doing the Double V campaign for victory in the war and then victory at home. Other groups, especially Japanese Americans who have been interned and who face prejudice and racism, are also fighting for the United States, as well as other groups of Americans or immigrant Americans who are going through periods of prejudice and discrimination, who are answering the call and fighting for the United States. So hopefully this covers the content that we see here in the standard, and you'll be able to answer some questions on the OST based on this information.